Imagine finding a $10,000 receipt for a diamond necklace on your kitchen floor now. Imagine realizing your husband didn't buy it for you, but for his young, beautiful mistress. But here is the truly terrifying part. His mother, your own mother-in-law, is the one who orchestrated the affair. What do you do when you are 8 months pregnant? Your bank accounts have been secretly drained, and the family you married into is actively building a legal case to declare you legally insane, just so they can steal your baby and your trust fund. You don't cry, you don't scream, and you certainly don't pack a bag and run away in the middle of the night. Instead, you smile. You play the role of the weak, unraveling wife they expect you to be, while meticulously plotting the most devastating, perfectly legal destruction they will ever see. Welcome to a story of absolute betrayal and the cold-blooded, brilliant revenge of a mother pushed to the very edge. This story isn't just about revenge, it is a masterclass in survival, reminding us that your greatest vulnerability can become your most lethal weapon if you choose strategy over panic. If you are ready to watch a manipulative, arrogant villain get exactly what they deserve, hit that like button to let the algorithm know you love a good payback. Drop a comment below telling me what you would have done in the first 30 seconds. And make sure to subscribe and share this with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength. Now, let's dive into the story of Clara.
The heavy leather purse hit the floor. It sounded like a dropped stone. The gold clasp snapped open on impact, spilling its secrets across the cold marble tiles of the kitchen floor. Lipsticks, a compact mirror, mints, and a crumpled piece of thick white paper. Clara gasped, grabbing her lower back. She was 32 years old and exactly 8 months pregnant. Her body felt heavy, completely foreign to her. Everything ached. Her swollen ankles throbbed against the straps of her sandals. She took a deep breath, resting one hand on the massive curve of her belly. "Oh, goodness," Eleanor sighed, waving a manicured hand in the air. "Look at what I have done. I am so clumsy today." Eleanor was Harrison's mother. She was 62, wore a perfectly tailored beige linen suit, and smelled of heavy rose perfume. The scent was always too strong. It clung to the furniture long after she left. It lingered in the air, thick and cloying, demanding your attention, just like Eleanor herself. "I can get it, Eleanor. Don't strain yourself, dear. You look exhausted. Actually, you look incredibly pale. Are you eating enough iron?" It was a classic Eleanor compliment, wrapped in concern, delivered like a paper cut. Clara ignored the sting. She braced her hand against the edge of the kitchen island. The marble was freezing under her palm. Slowly, awkwardly, she lowered herself to a squat. Her knees popped in the quiet room. She began gathering the items: the gold-plated mirror, the expensive crimson lipstick, and then her fingers brushed against the crumpled white paper. It was a receipt. Clara did not mean to snoop. She truly didn't. But the bold black ink caught her eye. The logo at the top belonged to a high-end jewelry boutique downtown, a place Harrison could never afford, a place Clara had only ever looked at through the display window. Her eyes scanned the printed lines: diamond teardrop pendant, 18-karat white gold chain, total $10,000. Clara stopped breathing. $10,000. They didn't have $10,000. They were saving for a crib. They were saving for the hospital bills. Harrison was a junior executive at his late father's firm, but his salary was modest. They lived on a strict budget, but there, at the very bottom of the receipt, was a signature. It was a messy, hurried scrawl, but Clara knew every curve of it. She had seen it on their marriage certificate 5 years ago. She had seen it on their mortgage documents. It was Harrison's signature. A high-pitched ringing started in Clara's ears. The sound of the refrigerator humming faded away. The ticking of the wall clock disappeared. The only thing left in the world was that piece of paper. "He bought me a present," her mind whispered. "It's a push present, a surprise for the baby." It made sense. It had to make sense. Husbands bought their pregnant wives jewelry all the time. It was a grand gesture, a way to say thank you for carrying their child. Perhaps he had saved up his bonuses. Perhaps he had taken out a small loan. Clara smiled, a wave of sudden immense guilt washing over her. She was ruining his surprise. She looked up, ready to hand the paper back to Eleanor, ready to pretend she hadn't seen a thing. But Eleanor was already looking at her. Eleanor was standing perfectly still. Her chin was tilted down. Her eyes were locked onto Clara's face, and those eyes were completely, utterly cold. There was no warmth, no shared secret, no playful wink to suggest. Clara had just stumbled upon a beautiful surprise. There was only a chilling, predatory stillness. Before Clara could speak, Eleanor lunged forward. She snatched the receipt right out of Clara's trembling hand. The edge of the paper gave Clara a tiny, sharp paper cut on her index finger. "I will take that," Eleanor said. Her voice was flat, empty of its usual theatrical sigh. Clara lost her balance. She tipped backward, landing hard on the kitchen floor. Pain shot up her tailbone. She cradled her belly instinctively. Letting out a sharp breath, Eleanor did not offer her hand. She did not ask if Clara was okay. She simply folded the receipt with terrifying precision, tucked it into the inner zip pocket of her purse, and snapped the gold clasp shut. "You really should be more careful, Clara," Eleanor said smoothly, looking down at her daughter-in-law, sitting on the floor. "Falling at this stage of the pregnancy can be dangerous. It makes a woman look careless, unfit, even." Clara stared up at her. The rose perfume was suffocating. "What was that?" Clara whispered. Her voice shook. "What was what, dear?" "That receipt. It had Harrison's signature on it. For $10,000. Eleanor smiled. It did not reach her eyes. "Oh, that. It is nothing for you to worry your pretty little head about. Harrison's just handling some family business for me." "An investment, you know, he manages my accounts at a jewelry store?" Clara asked. "Business gifts, Clara. Corporate networking. Something you wouldn't quite understand, seeing as you just draw pictures on your computer all day. Graphic design. It was called graphic design." Clara had a degree. She had a thriving freelance business. But to Eleanor, it was just drawing pictures, now, Eleanor said, stepping over Clara's legs and heading toward the front door. "I must be going. I have a luncheon at the club. Tell my son I will send him on Sunday for family dinner." "And Clara?" Eleanor paused by the doorway, looking back over her shoulder. "Do try to look presentable on Sunday. You have been letting yourself go lately. It is not a good look for a wife." The heavy oak door closed with a firm click. Clara sat on the floor for a long time. The silence in the house was deafening. The marble was pulling the heat right out of her skin. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking violently. "I am not crazy," she thought. "I know what I saw. That was not a corporate gift. You do not buy a tenth of dollar diamond teardrop pendant for a business associate. And if it was a gift for Clara, Eleanor would not have snatched it away with such vicious speed. Eleanor would not have looked at her with such open contempt. Stiff. If it was a gift for Clara, Eleanor would have been furious that Harrison spent the money. She would have complained about it. Instead, Eleanor was hiding it. Just why would a mother help her son hide a massive jewelry purchase from his pregnant wife? Suddenly, a sharp, hard kick hit Clara right in the ribs, her baby girl, a physical reminder of the life they were supposed to be building. Clara let out a sob, pressing her hands against her stomach. "It's okay," Clara whispered to the empty room. "It's okay. Just hormonal. Overreacting. There is a logical explanation." She dragged herself up off the floor. Her lower back screamed in protest. She walked over to the kitchen sink and turned on the cold water. She splashed her face. She looked at herself in the window reflection. Eleanor was right about one thing. She looked exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin under her eyes. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot. She was wearing maternity leggings and one of Harrison's old college shirts. She didn't feel beautiful. She felt like a vessel. Clara reached for her phone on the counter. She opened her messages. Harrison. She typed out a message. "Your mom just left. When are you coming home? Can we talk?" She stared at the screen. "Delete, delete, delete." She typed again. "Hey, honey, dinner will be ready at 6. Miss you." She hit send. Then she began the wait. She chopped carrots. She peeled potatoes. She seasoned a chicken. She moved through the kitchen like a ghost, mechanically performing the duties of a good wife. But her mind was spinning. She checked her phone. 4:30 in the afternoon. No reply. She checked again. 5:15 left on red. 3 times. Lock, unlock, refresh. Lock, unlock, refresh. Lock, unlock, refresh. It was a terrible, agonizing cycle. The anxiety built in her chest like trapped steam. Every time a car drove past the house, her head snapped toward the window. Every time the house settled, she thought it was the garage door opening. 6 o'clock came and went. The chicken was done. The potatoes were cold. At 6:30, her phone buzzed. Harrison, so sorry, babe. Crisis at the office. Going to be late. Eat without me. Love you. Clara stared at the text. Love you. Two words that used to make her heart flutter. Now, they felt like a heavy lead blanket. She didn't eat. She couldn't stomach the thought of food. Instead, she sat at the kitchen island, staring at the exact spot on the floor where the receipt had landed. She played the scene over and over in her head. The signature, the $10,000, the cold, dead look in Eleanor's eyes. Time crawled. 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10:30. Clara turned off all the lights in the house, except for the small lamp in the hallway. She sat in the dark living room, wrapped in a blanket, waiting. Finally, at 11:15, the headlights of Harrison's car swept across the living room window. The garage door rumbled open. The heavy door leading to the mudroom clicked shut. Clara? Harrison called out softly. You awake? Clara stood up. She tightened the blanket around her shoulders. I'm here, she said, stepping into the hallway light, startled. He took off his suit jacket, tossing it carelessly over the banister. He was 35, with thick dark hair and a charming, easy smile that had made Clara fall in love with him in college. But tonight, that smile looked strained. He looked exhausted. His tie was loosened. His collar was unbuttoned. Hey, he said, walking over to her. He wrapped his arms around her, kissing the top of her head. I'm sorry I'm so late. The quarterly reports were a nightmare. My father's old partners are riding me hard. Clara closed her eyes. She leaned into his chest, seeking the familiar comfort of her husband. She wanted to smell his usual scent, sandalwood, clean laundry, the faint, bitter aroma of the terrible coffee from his office break room. She took a deep breath. Her eyes snapped open. He did not smell like sandalwood. He did not smell like office coffee. He smelled like vanilla. It was a natural scent. It was cheap, synthetic, and incredibly sweet, like a body lotion from a drugstore, like spun sugar. It was a young scent. It was a woman's scent. Clara froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs so hard she thought it might break them. Harrison, she whispered, pulling back slightly to look at his face. Yeah, babe? He asked, rubbing his eyes. He wouldn't meet her gaze. He was looking everywhere but at her, at the floor, at the wall, at the ceiling. Where were you tonight? I told you, he said, a hint of annoyance creeping into his voice. The office. It was a disaster. I've been staring at spreadsheets for 14 hours. I'm dead on my feet. He stepped back, breaking the embrace. I'm going to take a shower, he said quickly. Then I'm crashing. Don't wait up, he turned, and walked rapidly up the stairs. Clara stood completely still in the dim hallway. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying speed, the late nights, the missing money, the $10,000 diamond teardrop pendant, the cheap vanilla perfume, and his mother knew. His mother had the receipt in her purse. Clara raised her trembling hand to her face. The tiny paper cut on her index finger throbbed. She wasn't crazy. She was being destroyed, and the demolition was an inside job. The mattress dipped in the dark. It was 1:30 in the morning. Harrison had stayed in the shower for 45 minutes. When he finally climbed into bed, his skin was damp. The cheap vanilla scent was completely gone. He had scrubbed it away, replacing it with the harsh, sharp smell of medicinal mint soap. Clara lay perfectly still. Her back was turned to him. She kept her eyes squeezed shut. She focused entirely on her chest. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. She was pretending to be asleep. She matched her breathing to a slow, fake, rhythmic pattern so she would not have to speak to him. If she spoke, she would scream. If she screamed, the fragile shell of her life would shatter before she was ready. So she played dead in her own bed. Harrison shifted, pulling the heavy down comforter over his shoulders. Within 10 minutes, his breathing grew deep and even. He was fast asleep. Clara lay awake in the dark. The silence stretched. The clock on the nightstand ticked, ticked, ticked. The next evening was Sunday. Family dinner at Eleanor S. Estate. The drive up the winding gravel driveway was excruciating. The tires crunched loudly against the stones. Harrison tapped his fingers nervously against the leather steering wheel. He had not said more than 10 words to Clara all day. Clara's maternity dress, a dark navy wrap, felt suffocating. Her baby was restless, kicking sharply against her ribs. Mother said she invited a guest tonight, Harrison muttered, staring straight ahead at the massive iron doors of the house. Clara frowned. A guest on a Sunday? She always says Sundays are strictly for family. It's just someone from the office, Harrison said quickly. Too quickly, he put the car in park and unbuckled his seatbelt before the engine fully died. A new assistant. Mother wanted to welcome her to the firm. Just be polite, okay? Clara felt a cold knot form in her throat. She nodded slowly. Eleanor opened the door before they even rang the bell. The heavy scent of rose perfume drifted out onto the porch, instantly turning Clara's stomach. Darlings! Eleanor sang out. She kissed Harrison on both cheeks. She looked at Clara and offered a tight, closed-lipped smile. Clara, you made it. You look comfortable. Thank you, Eleanor, Clara said quietly. They moved into the grand foyer. The crystal chandelier cast harsh, glittering light across the marble floor. Our guest should be arriving any moment, Eleanor said, checking her gold wristwatch. Harrison, pour the wine. Clara, there is sparkling water in the kitchen for you. The doorbell chimed, a deep, resonant sound that echoed through the massive house. Harrison stiffened. The wine bottle in his hand clinked sharply against the edge of a crystal glass. He did not look toward the door. Eleanor glided across the foyer. She pulled the heavy wooden door open with a dramatic flourish. Paige, darling, come in, come in. A young woman stepped into the light. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. Paige was beautiful. There was no denying it. She looked to be about 27 years old. She had long, silky, blonde hair that cascaded perfectly over her shoulders. She wore a tailored cream-colored dress that hugged her narrow waist. She carried a small, expensive leather clutch. And as she walked past Clara to greet Harrison, a wave of perfume washed over the room. Spun sugar. Synthetic, sweet, and unmistakable. Vanilla, the exact same scent Clara had smelled on her husband's collar the night before. Clara's hands began to shake. She gripped the back of a velvet dining chair to steady herself. Her knuckles turned stark white. Paige, this is my daughter-in-law. Clara, Eleanor said smoothly. Clara, this is Paige, Harrison's incredibly talented new assistant. Paige smiled. It was a bright, dazzling smile. It is so lovely to finally meet you, Clara. Harrison talks about you all the time, does he? Clara managed to whisper. Her throat felt like it was filled with sand. Oh, absolutely, Paige said. And you are just glowing. When is the baby due? 4 weeks, Clara said. They moved into the formal dining room. The table was set with Eleanor's finest china, heavy silver cutlery, tall, unlit taper candles. Clara took her seat directly across from Paige. Harrison sat at the head of the table, avoiding eye contact with everyone. He suddenly found the cloth napkin in his lap deeply fascinating. Eleanor sat at the opposite end, presiding over the table like a queen on a throne. Well, Eleanor said, raising her glass of red wine, to new beginnings and to new additions to our little corporate family. Paige raised her water glass. She reached up with her free hand to brush a stray lock of blonde hair behind her ear. The movement shifted the neckline of her cream dress. The dining room light caught it. It flashed brilliantly, throwing a tiny rainbow of refracted light across the pristine white tablecloth. Clara stopped breathing. Resting perfectly against Pest's delicate collarbone was a necklace. It was a diamond teardrop pendant. It hung from a delicate 18-karat white gold chain, $10,000. Clara felt the blood drain completely from her face. The room started to spin. The buzzing in her ears returned, louder, this time. A furious, angry hornet's nest trapped inside her skull. She remembered the receipt on the floor. She remembered the sloppy signature. She remembered Eleanor snatching it away. Business gifts, Clara. Clara stared at the diamond. It sat right in the hollow of Paige's throat, a shining, glittering beacon of absolute betrayal. What a stunning piece of jewelry you are wearing tonight, Paige, Eleanor said. Her voice cut through the silence like a scalpel. Clara's head snapped toward her mother-in-law. Eleanor was holding her wine glass. She was looking directly at the diamond. Paige blushed. It was a pretty practiced pink flush across her cheeks. She reached up and touched the diamond gently with her fingertips. Thank you, Eleanor, Paige said softly. It was a gift from a very special admirer. He is incredibly generous. Well, Eleanor said, taking a slow sip of her dark red wine. Any man with eyes can see you deserve to be spoiled. A young, vibrant woman like you, it is a tragedy when a man's efforts go unappreciated by those who have grown complacent. Harrison coughed loudly. He grabbed his water glass and took a massive, desperate gulp. He still refused to look up. Eleanor looked right at Clara. A cold, victorious smirk played on her lips. Then, slowly, deliberately, Eleanor shifted her gaze to Paige, and she winked. A slow, deliberate, conspiratorial wink. Clara's world tilted. The floor felt like it was dropping out from under her. The walls of the dining room pressed in. I am not crazy. The thought was bright. It was clear. It cut through the panic like a lighthouse beam. I know what I saw. They are doing this right in front of me. They were not just hiding an affair. They were parading it. They were flaunting it at the dinner table. Eleanor had orchestrated this entire evening just to show Clara exactly where she stood. Eleanor had bought the necklace with Harrison's money. Eleanor had invited the mistress. Eleanor was sitting there, drinking wine, watching Clara's heart break for her own cruel entertainment. It was a public execution of her marriage, and her husband was sitting quietly, letting his mother pull the lever. Clara's stomach roiled. A sudden, violent wave of nausea hit her. She stood up abruptly. Her heavy wooden chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. The screeching sound echoed off the high ceiling. Harrison finally looked up. His eyes were wide with panic. "Clara, excuse me," Clara whispered. She did not wait for a response. She turned and walked out of the dining room. She moved as fast as her pregnant body would allow. Down the long, carpeted hallway, past the portraits of Harrison's ancestors, staring down at her in judgment. She reached the guest bathroom. At the end of the hall, she pushed the heavy oak door open, stepped inside, and slammed it shut. She reached for the heavy brass lock. Click. The sound of the lock sliding into place was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. Clara leaned over the pedestal sink. She grabbed the cold metal handles and twisted them hard. Water roared out of the brass faucet, splashing against the porcelain bowl. The rushing sound drowned out the voices from the dining room. Clara's legs gave out. She slid down the wall. She landed on the floor with a soft thud. The hexagonal tiles were freezing cold through her thin dress. She pulled her knees up as far as her massive belly would allow. She crossed her arms over her stomach. Holding her baby tightly, she did not cry. Crying felt too small for what this was. Crying was for a scraped knee. Crying was for a sad movie. This was annihilation. She sat fully clothed on the bathroom floor. The air conditioning vent blew cold air down the back of her neck. The running water splashed wildly in the sink above her. The bright, fluorescent vanity lights hummed. Clara closed her eyes. She focused on the freezing tile beneath her palms. She focused on the steady, rhythmic kicks of the little girl inside her. She let the shock wash over her. She let the raw, breathless agony tear through her chest. She sat there for 3 minutes, just breathing, just surviving. When she finally opened her eyes, the terror was gone. The confusion had evaporated. In its place, something new began to burn. Something cold, something sharp. She reached up and turned off the faucet. Flet. The sudden silence in the bathroom was deafening. Clara placed both hands on the edge of the sink and pulled herself up. She looked at her reflection in the mirror. She smoothed the wrinkles out of her navy dress. She tucked a loose strand of brown hair behind her ear. She was 8 months pregnant. She was alone. She was betrayed by the man she loved and hunted by the woman who raised him. But as she stared into her own tired eyes, Clara made a silent vow. They thought she was just a vessel. They thought she would quietly break and disappear. They were wrong. The car ride home was completely silent. Harrison kept the radio off. He kept his eyes fixed strictly on the road. The streetlights flashed rhythmically across his face, illuminating the sharp line of his jaw. He looked tense. He looked guilty. Clara did not look at him. She stared out the passenger window at the passing trees. She rested her hands on her swollen belly. A younger, more naive Clara would have screamed. She would have thrown her purse at him. She would have demanded answers about the diamond, the perfume, and his mother's cruel wink. But the woman sitting in the passenger seat tonight was not naive. She was terrified. And terror makes you remarkably quiet. They arrived home. Harrison mumbled something about an early morning meeting and practically sprinted upstairs to the guest bedroom. He closed the door. The lock clicked. Clara stood in the dark hallway. She listened to the silence of her own house. It was 2 in the morning. She was exhausted. Her body begged for sleep, but her mind was racing at 1,000 miles an hour. She walked into the living room. She sat heavily on the gray sofa. She reached for the glass coffee table and picked up the family iPad. It was a shared device. They used it to order groceries. They used it to look up paint colors for the nursery. Harrison rarely used it for work, which meant he probably forgot his personal email was still logged in. Clara unlocked the screen. The harsh blue light illuminated her pale face in the dark room. First, she opened the banking app. She clicked on their joint savings account, the account they had built together. The account meant for the hospital bills, the crib, and her maternity leave. The screen loaded. Clara stopped breathing. The balance was supposed to be $32,000. It was $4,200. Nearly $28,000 were gone. Vanished. She scrolled frantically through the transaction history. Massive withdrawals. 5,000 here, 10,000 there. The descriptions were terrifyingly vague. Consulting fee, cash withdrawal, legal retainer. Legal retainer? Clara's hands began to shake. The iPad rattled against her wedding ring. She closed the banking app. She opened the email app. Harrison's personal inbox loaded. It looked normal. Spam emails, golf store promotions, alerts from the neighborhood watch. She typed page into the search bar. 0 results. He was smart enough to delete those. She typed Eleanor. Dozens of emails popped up. Most were forwards of recipes or mundane family updates. Clara scrolled past them. She checked the trash folder. Empty. She checked the deleted items. Empty. Then she noticed a custom folder tucked away at the very bottom of the sidebar. It was titled Property Taxes 2021 point. They did not own property in 2021 point. They were renting a small apartment back then. Clara tapped the folder. A long chain of emails appeared. The sender was Eleanor. The recipient was Harrison. The subject line was simply Phase 2. Clara opened the first email. It was dated 3 months ago. Harrison. The email read, I signed the lease for Paige's new apartment today. It is only 10 minutes from your office. I paid the rent 6 months in advance out of my personal account. Do not use the joint card for her dinners anymore. Clara notices too much. Clara swallowed hard. The bile rose in the back of her throat. His mother was paying the mistress rent. His mother had handpicked the girl, set her up in an apartment, and was actively coaching her son on how to hide the financial trail. Clara's finger trembled as she tapped the next email in the chain. It was dated 2 weeks ago. Harrison, you need to be careful. The girl is getting attached. You must keep Paige happy, but do not lose sight of the ultimate goal. Have you documented Clara's mood swings like we discussed? Mood swings? Clara frowned, scrolling down frantically to read Harrison's reply. Yes, mother. I recorded her crying in the kitchen last Tuesday. I also saved the text messages where she sounds paranoid about me working late. Clara's heart stopped. He was recording her, the man she slept next to, the father of her child. He was secretly recording her while she cried over burnt toast or an aching back. She tapped the final email. It was from Eleanor, sent just yesterday. Good. Keep gathering the evidence. I spoke with Dr. Evans at the club. He agrees that severe hormonal imbalance can mimic postpartum psychosis. With your recordings and the financial instability we are creating in her personal account, no judge will give her custody. The moment that baby is born, we file for full sole custody. She will be deemed mentally unfit. You will have your child. I will have my grandchild. And Clara will be sent back to the gutter where she belongs. The iPad slipped from Clara's hands. It hit the carpet with a soft thud. The screen went black. The room was completely dark again. Clara could not move. She could not breathe. The walls of the living room were spinning violently. This was not an affair. An affair was a mistake in a hotel room. An affair was a drunken lapse in judgment. This was a calculated, cold-blooded assassination. They did not just want to break her heart. They wanted to take her baby. They were actively building a legal case to declare her insane. They were draining the bank accounts so she could not afford a lawyer. They were pushing her to the brink, hoping she would snap, so they could point their fingers and say, "Look, look at the crazy woman." Clara pulled her knees up to her chest. She wrapped her arms around her stomach. She knew others would judge her. If someone were watching this like a movie, they would yell at the screen. They would tell her to pack a bag. They would tell her to drive away that exact second. They would call her weak for staying. But unless you have a baby kicking your ribs and a joint bank account that has just been drained, you cannot understand the paralyzing math of survival. Where would she go? She had $4,000 to her name. A hospital delivery cost triple that amount. If she ran away tonight, they would use it against her in court. They would say the pregnant, unstable wife wandered out into the night. It would be the final nail in her coffin. She had to stay. Just a little longer. She had to build her raft before she jumped off the sinking ship. Clara picked up her cell phone from the coffee table. She opened the family location tracking app. She clicked on Harrison's icon. He was upstairs in the guest room. She stared at the little blue dot. Her thumb hovered over the screen 3 times. Lock, unlock, refresh, lock, unlock, refresh. Lock, unlock, refresh. The little blue dot did not move. He was sleeping soundly, dreaming of a future that did not include her. Clara set the phone down. The tears finally came. They were not loud, hysterical sobs. They were silent, hot, and furious. They burned her cheeks. She wiped them away with the back of her hand. She looked toward the dark staircase. "You want to play a game, Eleanor?" Clara whispered into the empty room. "Fine, but I am not playing by your rules anymore." The morning sun poured through the kitchen window. It was too bright. It felt violently cheerful for a house built on lies. Clara stood by the coffee maker. She watched the dark liquid drip slowly into the glass pot. She had not slept a single minute. Instead, she had spent the remaining hours of the night mapping out her own survival. Footsteps sounded on the stairs. Harrison walked into the kitchen. He was dressed in a crisp navy suit. His hair was perfectly styled. He looked rested. He looked like a man who did not have a care in the world. "Morning, babe," he said, opening the refrigerator to grab a bottle of water. Clara turned around. She forced her facial muscles to relax. She pasted a mild, tired smile on her face. It was the hardest performance of her life. "Good morning," she said softly. "Did you sleep well?" "Like a rock," he replied, unscrewing the cap of his water. "The quarterly reports really took it out of me. I am glad that is over." He lied with absolute ease. He did not stutter. He did not look away. He drank his water while looking her dead in the eye. Clara decided to test the waters, just a little. "Harrison," she began, keeping her voice casual. "The furniture store called yesterday. We need to pay the final balance on the nursery furniture today. It is $2,000. I was going to transfer it from the joint savings account." Harrison stopped drinking. He lowered the plastic bottle. Just for a fraction of a second, his shoulders went rigid. Then he smiled. It was his signature charming, boyish smile. "Actually, babe," he said smoothly, "hold off on that. I moved the bulk of our savings into a high-yield corporate bond yesterday. The interest rates were incredible. It is a locked account for 6 months. I wanted to start a serious college fund for the baby." Clara stared at him. It was seamless, a perfect, logical, responsible lie. If she had not read those emails, she would have believed him. She would have kissed his cheek and thanked him for being such a wonderful provider. "Oh," Clara said, nodding slowly. "A bond. That is very smart. But how do we pay for the crib?" "To put it on the credit card." "For now," he said, checking his watch. "I will pay the statement balance from my private checking next month." "Easy." He walked over and kissed her forehead. "I have to run," he said. "Another big day at the office. Love you." "Love you too," Clara whispered. She watched his car pull out of the driveway. Her husband was a stranger. He was a smiling, handsome ghost. By 1 in the afternoon, Clara could not sit in the quiet house any longer. The air felt too thin. She needed to look the monster in the eye. She drove to Eleanor's estate. She did not call ahead. She simply parked her car on the gravel driveway and used her spare key to unlock the heavy front door. The house was deadly quiet. Clara walked across the marble foyer. The massive antique grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly. Tick, tick, ticked. The sound echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings. It sounded like a countdown. She found Eleanor in the conservatory. Her mother-in-law was sitting in a high-backed wicker chair, surrounded by lush green ferns and blooming orchids. She was sipping tea from a delicate porcelain cup and reading a thick hardcover book. Eleanor looked up. She did not look surprised. She looked irritated. "Clara," Eleanor said, closing her book with a soft snap. "To what do I owe this unexpected intrusion? It is the middle of the day. Do you not have pictures to draw?" Clara walked into the room. She did not sit down. "I need to ask you something, Eleanor, and I want the truth." Eleanor sighed. She set her teacup down on the glass table. "You look manic, Clara. Your hair is a mess. What is this about?" "It is about the money," Clara said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of how steady it was. "There is nearly $28,000 missing from our joint savings account. Harrison told me he put it in a bond, but I know that is a lie." Eleanor's expression did not change. Not a single muscle twitched in her perfectly preserved face. "If Harrison says he invested it, then he invested it," Eleanor said flatly. "You really should not question your husband's financial decisions. He is the one carrying the burden of providing for you." "Providing for me?" Clara let out a short, hollow laugh. "Like he provides for Paige? Is that why you bought her that $10,000 diamond? Because she is such a hard worker?" Eleanor sat perfectly still. The silence in the conservatory stretched. The ticking of the grandfather clock from the hallway seemed to grow louder. Then Eleanor smiled. It was a terrifying, pitying smile. "Oh, Clara," Eleanor whispered, shaking her head slowly. "My poor, sick girl." "I am not sick," Clara snapped. "I saw the receipt. I saw the necklace on her neck. You winked at her." Eleanor stood up. She smoothed the front of her expensive silk blouse. She took a step toward Clara. The heavy, suffocating scent of rose perfume filled the space between them. "Listen to yourself," Eleanor said softly. Her tone was dripping with fake sympathy. "You are having delusions. You are invading your husband's privacy. You are tracking down missing money that does not exist. You are imagining secret glances at dinner parties." Clara took a step back. "Stop it. Stop lying." "I am not lying, Clara. You are deeply unwell." Eleanor's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "Pregnancy can do terrible things to a fragile woman's mind. The hormones, the stress, it can cause severe paranoia. It can make you see things that are not there." "I know. What I saw, do you?" Eleanor asked, tilting her head. "Because if you tell anyone this ridiculous story about diamonds and mistresses, they will not believe you. They will look at your unwashed hair, they will look at your erratic behavior, and they will see exactly what I see. A hysterical, unstable woman." A dry, metallic taste flooded Clara's mouth. It was the undeniable taste of pure fear. Eleanor took another step forward, backing Clara toward the door. "In fact," Eleanor continued smoothly, "I was just speaking with Dr. Evans at the country club yesterday. He is a very prominent psychiatrist. We were discussing how untreated prenatal paranoia almost always spirals into postpartum psychosis. It is a tragic condition. Women who suffer from it are a danger to themselves. And, more importantly, they are a danger to their infants." Threat hung in the air. Heavy, absolute. Eleanor was telling her exactly what would happen. If Clara fought back, Eleanor would make the medical call. Eleanor had the money. Eleanor had the influence. Clara would be locked in a psychiatric ward, and Harrison would walk away with full custody of their newborn baby. "You are a monster," Clara whispered. Her voice broke. "I am a mother," Eleanor corrected sharply. Her eyes flashed with sudden, violent anger. "And I will protect my son and my grandchild from a woman who is clearly losing her grip on reality. Now go home, Clara. Take a nap. Calm your nerves. If you continue this hysterical outburst, I will be forced to make a very difficult phone call for the safety of my family." Clara could not speak. The metallic taste in her mouth grew stronger. She turned around and fled. She practically ran through the hallway, the loud ticking of the grandfather clock chasing her all the way to the front door. She climbed into her car and locked the doors. She gripped the steering wheel so hard her hands went numb. They had trapped her. They had built a perfect invisible cage and locked her inside it. If she screamed, she was crazy. If she fought, she was dangerous. If she stayed quiet, she was erased. Clara rested her forehead against the steering wheel. She closed her eyes. Somewhere along the way, I became invisible to them. She whispered into the empty car, "But they will see me now." She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. She bypassed the tracking app. She bypassed her text messages. She scrolled through her contacts until she found a name she had not called in. 3 months Bridget, her childhood best friend, and the most ruthless forensic accountant in the city. Clara hit dial. The phone rang twice before Bridget answered. "Clara," Bridget said. Her voice was sharp. "Professional of the workday. Are you in labor?" "No," Clara said. She gripped the steering wheel. She stared at the dashboard of her parked car. "I need your help, Bridget. I need an accountant." "You have Harrison for that." "I do not have Harrison anymore," Clara said. The words tasted like ash. "He is draining our accounts. He is hiding money. His mother is helping him. They are trying to build a case to say I am mentally unfit, that so they can take the baby when she is born." Clara braced herself for the reaction. She waited for the gasp. She waited for the pity. She waited for the barrage of questions about the affair. Instead, there was a long, heavy silence on the line. Then, the rapid, aggressive clicking of a computer keyboard. "Bridget?" "I am logging into my secure server," Bridget said flatly. There was zero panic in her voice. Just cold, absolute focus. "I need your bank login. I need his social security number. I need every password you can remember. Do not cry, Clara. Crying does not hold up in court. Paper trails do." A massive wave of relief washed over Clara. She let out a shaky breath. "Thank you. Do not thank me yet," Bridget replied. "We are going to war against Eleanor. That woman is a snake in a designer suit. Call me tonight when he goes to sleep. We have a lot of digging to do." The call ended. Fast forward to midnight. The house was completely silent. Harrison was upstairs in the guest room. The heavy oak door was locked from the inside. Clara sat on the floor of Harrison's home office. The only light came from the glowing screen of her laptop and the small desk lamp. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and stale printer ink. She had her phone wedged between her ear and her shoulder. Bridget was on speakerphone. "Okay," Bridget muttered. The sound of her mouse clicking rapidly echoed through the phone. "I am in the joint account. I see the withdrawals. He is not putting this in a corporate bond, Clara. That is a lie." "I know," Clara whispered. She was carefully sliding open the bottom drawer of Harrison's filing cabinet. "He is funneling it into a private account," Bridget explained. "And from there, it looks like he has checks to an LLCC, registered under Eleanor's name, a property management company, to pay for Paige's apartment," Clara confirmed. "Exactly. It is sloppy. He is a terrible criminal." Bridget paused. The typing stopped. "But Clara, there is something else." "What?" "Time. I am looking at his tax returns from the past 3 years. The ones he filed after his father passed away. The numbers do not make sense. His declared income is decent, but the corporate dividends from the family firm are tiny." Clara frowned. She pulled a thick manila folder from the cabinet. "What does that mean?" "It means Eleanor is controlling the purse strings of the company," Bridget said. "But that is legally impossible. When Harrison's father died, the firm was supposed to be split. I remember the rumors. His father did not trust Eleanor with the entire estate." Clara's hand froze on the manila folder. "Wait, you think Eleanor does not actually own the money?" "I think Eleanor is a very good illusionist," Bridget said slowly. "I need you to find the original estate documents, the will, the trust agreements, anything signed by his father before he died." Clara stared at the rows of perfectly organized files. "Harrison keeps everything locked up. I do not even know where to look." "Think," Bridget commanded gently. "Men like Harrison always keep a physical copy of their insurance policies. Find the safety deposit box keys, find the legal retainer receipts. Dig, Clara." They hung up at 2 in the morning. Clara was exhausted. Her back screamed in agony. Her eyes burned from staring at fine print. She had found nothing about a trust. Just endless, meaningless files. Her whole life was collapsing. The legal threats from Eleanor were mounting. Her husband was sleeping in the next room, dreaming of his mistress. And what did Clara do? She went downstairs to the kitchen. She turned on the overhead fluorescent lights. The harsh glare illuminated the pristine marble counters. She walked over to the pantry. She opened the double doors. She began to reorganize the spice rack. She pulled every single glass jar out of the cabinet. She lined them up on the counter. She wiped down the Bevan shelves. Then she started putting them back, strictly alphabetical. Anise, basil, cardamom, cumin, dill, fennel. Her hands moved mechanically. Her breathing was shallow. She fixed a label that was peeling. She tightened a loose lid. It was an absurd, ridiculous thing to do at 2:30 in the morning. But she could not stop. Because when you cannot control your failing marriage, you can control the pantry. When your mother-in-law is plotting to steal your child, you make sure the garlic powder is perfectly aligned with the ginger. She scrubbed a microscopic, invisible stain on the counter until her knuckles turned stark white. Finally, she stopped. She dropped the sponge into the sink. She walked down the hall and slowly pushed open the door to the nursery. The room was painted a soft, soothing cream. Moonlight filtered through the white wooden blinds, casting long shadows across the floor. In the corner stood the beautiful mahogany crib they had picked out together. It was empty. Clara walked over to the rocking chair. Draped over the back was a pale yellow baby blanket. She picked it up. The fleece was incredibly soft against her tired hands. She folded it in half, then in quarters. Then she shook it out and folded it again, over and over and over. The repetitive motion grounded her. It pulled her out of the spiraling panic and back into her body. She pressed the folded yellow fabric to her cheek. It smelled like fresh laundry detergent. Clean, innocent, untainted by the poison spreading through the rest of the house. "I deserve better than this," Clara whispered into the quiet room. The statement hung in the air. It was not a question. It was not a plea. It was a cold, hard fact. She had been a good wife. She had been supportive, kind, and loyal. She had ignored the small slights. She had forgiven the late nights. "Starting over feels impossible," she murmured softly to the empty crib. "But staying feels worse." She let the blanket fall back onto the chair. She was done crying. She was done reorganizing spices to distract herself. Bridget was right. Eleanor was a snake, and you do not negotiate with a snake. You cut off its head. Clara walked over to the small bookshelf in the corner of the nursery. Tucked between a stack of classic children's books was a small, ornate wooden box. It was a gift, given to Clara by Harrison's father, just weeks before he passed away from cancer. "Keep this safe, Clara." The old man had wheezed from his hospital bed. "Do not tell Eleanor. Do not even tell Harrison. When the time comes, you will know what it opens." Clara picked up the box. She opened the small brass latch. Inside, resting on a bed of faded red velvet, was a single heavy brass key. The cold metal bit into her palm as she picked it up. She did not know what lock it fit, but she knew exactly where to start looking. The heavy glass doors of First National Bank slid open. A blast of freezing air conditioning hit Clara in the face. The lobby smelled of polished granite and bitter coffee. It was 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. The bank was nearly empty. Clara walked up to the main desk. Her hands were sweating. The heavy brass key felt like a burning coal inside her coat pocket. "May I help you?" asked the manager. He was an older man with silver hair and a neat blue tie. His name tag read Thomas. "Yes," Clara said. Her voice wavered slightly. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I need to access a safety deposit box. It belonged to Arthur Sterling, my late father-in-law." Thomas typed on his computer. The keys clacked loudly in the quiet lobby. "Ah, yes. Box number 412, Thomas said. He looked up, his eyes dropping to her pregnant belly for a fraction of a second. "Do you have the key, ma'am, and your identification?" Clara placed her driver's license on the counter. Then, she pulled the brass key from her pocket and set it down. The metal clinked sharply against the glass counter. Thomas nodded. "Follow me, please." They walked past the tellers. They walked down a short, carpeted hallway. At the end of the hall was a massive steel vault door. It looked like something out of a movie, thick, heavy, impenetrable. They stepped inside. The vault was entirely silent. The hum of the air conditioning vanished. The air in here was stale and dry. It smelled like old metal and dust. Thomas stopped in front of a wall of small metal doors. He inserted his master key into the left slot of box, 412. "Your key, please," he said. Clara handed it over. Her fingers were trembling. Thomas slid her brass key into the right slot. He turned both keys at the exact same time. A heavy, satisfying click echoed in the small room. Thomas pulled the metal box out. It was long and flat. He carried it over to a small private viewing room just outside the vault. He set it down on the wooden table. "Take all the time you need, Mrs. Sterling," Thomas said, gently. He stepped out and closed the door. The door shut with a solid, muffled thud. Clara was completely alone. She stared at the gray metal box. For a long moment, she could not move. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Whatever was inside this box had been hidden for 3 years. Hidden from Eleanor. Hidden from Harrison. She took a deep breath. She reached out and lifted the lid. The hinges squeaked slightly. Inside, there were no stacks of cash. There were no gold bars or expensive jewels. There was only a thick brown leather folder. Clara lifted it out. The leather was worn and soft. It smelled faintly of Arthur's old pipe tobacco. The familiar scent brought a sudden lump to her throat. Arthur had been a good man. He had loved Clara. He had always looked at his own wife, Eleanor, with a weary, tired sadness. Clara opened the folder. Inside was a stack of legal documents. At the very top, printed on thick, expensive paper, was a document titled the Sterling Family Trust. Clara began to read. The legal jargon was dense. It was filled with clauses and stipulations. But Clara forced herself to slow down. She read every single line. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Suddenly, Clara stopped breathing. She traced her finger over a paragraph. On page 4, she read it once. She read it twice. She read it a third time, just to make sure she was not hallucinating. Upon the event of my death, the entirety of my estate, including the primary residence, all liquid assets, and controlling shares of Sterling Incorporated, shall bypass my wife, Eleanor Sterling, and my son, Harrison Sterling. Clara's eyes went wide. Bypass. Arthur had cut them out. He had cut his own wife and son completely out of his will. Clara's eyes darted to the next sentence. These assets shall be placed into an irrevocable trust. The sole beneficiary of this trust shall be my first natural-born grandchild. The words hung in the air. Clara pressed her hand against her massive belly. Her baby girl kicked against her palm. Until the beneficiary reaches the age of 25, the document continued. The trust shall be managed by the child's primary custodial parent. Clara dropped the paper. It fluttered down and landed softly on the wooden table. The silence in the room was absolute. A wave of dizzying realization washed over her. Everything clicked into place. The missing puzzle pieces finally snapped together to form a terrifying, crystal-clear picture. Eleanor was not rich. Harrison was not rich. They were broke. They were living in a massive estate they did not own, spending money they were legally not entitled to touch. Arthur had known exactly what kind of woman his wife was. He had known his son was weak. He had locked the money away to protect his legacy. But there was a loophole, managed by the child's primary custodial parent. Clara gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. That was it. That was the entire plan. Eleanor did not just hate Clara. Eleanor needed Clara gone. If Clara remained married to Harrison, Clara would have equal control over the trust. Eleanor would never allow that. But if Clara was declared mentally unfit, if Clara was locked away in a psychiatric ward due to postpartum psychosis, then Harrison would get full sole custody of the baby. Harrison would become the sole manager of a multi-million-dollar trust, and Eleanor controlled Harrison. They did not want her baby out of love. They wanted her baby because she was a paycheck. Her daughter was nothing but a key to a bank vault. The jewelry for Paige, the gaslighting, the secret recordings. It was all a calculated, legal strategy to steal a fortune. A long silence filled the room. The terror that had paralyzed Clara for the last 3 days evaporated. It vanished completely. In its place, a cold, dark fury began to rise. It was not the frantic anger of a betrayed wife. It was the lethal, quiet strength of a mother protecting her young. Clara reached into her purse. She pulled out her phone. She opened the camera app and carefully photographed every single page of the trust document, every signature, every notary stamp. She made sure the flash was off. She double-checked the clarity of the text. When she was finished, she neatly stacked the papers back into the leather folder. She placed the folder back into the metal box. She closed the lid. The hinges squeaked again. She walked out of the viewing room. She handed the box back to Thomas. "Thank you, Thomas," Clara said. Her voice was completely steady. It did not shake at all. "You are very welcome, Mrs. Sterling," he smiled. Clara walked out of the bank and back into the sweltering heat of the parking lot. She unlocked her car and slid into the driver's seat. She did not turn the engine on right away. She sat in the silence. She placed both hands firmly on her steering wheel. They thought she was a naive, hysterical pregnant woman. They thought they had trapped her. Clara smiled. It was a terrifying, beautiful smile. The trap was indeed set. But Eleanor and Harrison were the ones standing inside it, and Clara had just found the lock. The next 3 days were a masterclass in deception. Clara did not confront Harrison. She did not yell. She did not pack a suitcase. Instead, she put on his old college shirts. She stopped brushing her hair. She perfected a blank, exhausted stare. She became exactly what they wanted her to be. A weak, confused, and rapidly unraveling pregnant woman. She caught Harrison recording her twice. Once she was staring out the kitchen window, crying softly. She made sure to look entirely disconnected from reality. She knew he was standing in the hallway with his phone out. She gave him the performance of a lifetime. She mumbled about shadows in the garden. She let him think the trap was working perfectly. But behind the blank stare, Clara was working. She spent hours on the phone with Bridget. They were quietly securing Clara's personal assets. They were freezing the remaining funds in the joint accounts under the guise of fraud protection. Clara was building her fortress, brick by brick. Friday evening arrived. The air outside was thick and humid. A summer storm was brewing. Sky turned a bruised, dark purple. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Harrison came home from the office early. He seemed unusually agitated. He paced the living room. He kept checking his watch. "Mother is coming over," Harrison announced, stopping near the fireplace. "She wants to check on you. She said you seemed unwell the other day." Clara sat on the sofa. She pulled a knitted blanket over her lap. "That is very kind of her," Clara said softly. Her voice was weak, pliable. The doorbell rang 10 minutes later. Tea. Harrison rushed to open it. Eleanor swept into the house. She brought the heavy scent of rose perfume and the damp smell of impending rain. She was carrying a sleek black leather briefcase. "Hello, Harrison," Eleanor said, kissing his cheek. She turned her sharp gaze to the sofa. "Clara, you look terrible." "I am just tired, Eleanor," Clara whispered. She stared at the carpet. Eleanor walked into the living room and sat in the armchair opposite Clara. She placed the black briefcase on the glass coffee table. "Well, exhaustion is to be expected," Eleanor said smoothly. "But we need to be practical. The baby will be here in a matter of weeks. We must ensure everything is in order. Legally speaking." Harrison stood behind his mother's chair. He looked incredibly uncomfortable. He refused to meet Clara's eyes. Eleanor popped the latches on her briefcase. The metal clicked sharply. She pulled out a thick stack of papers stapled together. She laid it on the glass table. "This is a standard family protocol document," Eleanor explained. Her tone was soothing. It was the tone a person uses to coax a frightened animal into a cage. "Arthur drew these up years ago. It is just a post-nuptial agreement, combined with a medical proxy. Everyone in the family signs one." Clara looked at the document. The title read Declaration of Custodial Waive and Medical Power of Attorney. It was not a standard family protocol. It was a death warrant for her life as a mother. "What does it do?" Clara asked, keeping her voice incredibly small. "It is merely a precaution, darling." Eleanor smiled. "It states that if you suffer from any complications after the birth, severe postpartum depression, for instance, or psychosis, Harrison will automatically assume full, uncontested custody of the child. It also gives him the power to make all medical and psychiatric decisions on your behalf." If Clara signed it, she was handing them the knife. They would not even need a judge. They would just show the doctor the paper, declare her insane, and walk away with her baby and her trust fund. A long silence filled the room. Outside, a roll of thunder shook the windows. The living room felt suffocatingly hot. "I see," Clara said slowly. "You think I am going to go crazy." "No one said that, babe," Harrison interjected quickly. His voice cracked slightly. "It is just paperwork for the hospital. Just in case." "Exactly," Eleanor purred. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a heavy gold pen. She set it next to the document. It is just to protect the baby. You do want to protect your baby, do you not, Clara? It was a brilliant evil manipulation. If Clara refused to sign, they would use her refusal as proof of her paranoia. They would say she was being unreasonable. Clara looked at the gold pen. She looked at the paper. Could I have a glass of water? Clara asked softly. She touched her throat. My mouth is so dry. I cannot focus, of course, Harrison said quickly, eager to escape the tension. He hurried into the kitchen. He returned a moment later with a tall glass of ice water. The glass was covered in thick, cold condensation. The ice cubes clinked together as he handed it to her. Clara took the glass. Her fingers brushed against the freezing, wet condensation. It grounded her. She held the glass in her left hand. She leaned forward awkwardly, her pregnant belly pressing against her knees. She reached out with her right hand to pick up the gold pen. She hovered the pen over the signature line. Eleanor leaned forward. Her eyes were wide. She looked like a predator watching its prey step into the snare. Her breathing grew shallow. Just sign on the bottom line, dear, Eleanor whispered. Clara paused. I am not crazy, Clara thought. I am the only sane person in this room. Clara shifted her weight. She let her left hand tremble, and then she simply let go of the glass. The heavy glass tipped forward. It hit the edge of the glass coffee table. The sharp crack of the glass shattering echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. A massive wave of freezing water and crushed ice flooded across the table. It hit the thick stack of legal papers. The water soaked into the expensive paper instantly. The black ink immediately began to run. The carefully typed words blurred into dark, illegible streaks of gray mud. The pages warped and curled upward as they drowned. The hiss of Eleanor's indrawn breath was loud and violent. Eleanor shot up from her chair. Her face turned dark red. Her mask of gentle concern vanished completely. What did you do? Eleanor shrieked. Her voice echoed off the ceiling. She grabbed the soaked papers. Water dripped down onto her expensive linen suit. The document was completely destroyed. The signature line was nothing but a washed-out puddle of blue and black ink. Clara gasped. She brought both hands up to her mouth in a perfect display of shock. Oh my goodness, Clara cried. She forced tears into her eyes. I am so sorry, my hand just slipped. I am so clumsy today. My wrists have been swelling so badly. Harrison stood frozen in shock. Eleanor glared at Clara. The older woman's chest heaved. The rose perfume could not hide the sudden sour smell of her absolute fury. You clumsy fool, Eleanor hissed, clutching the ruined papers. Do you have any idea how much it cost to have the lawyers draft this? Clara looked up at her mother-in-law. Behind the fake tears, Clara's eyes were completely cold, completely steady. I am sure Harrison can pay for a new one, Clara said softly, out of his corporate bonds. Harrison choked on a sudden cough. Eleanor stared at Clara. For the very first time, a flicker of genuine uncertainty crossed Eleanor's face. She looked at the spilled water. She looked at Clara's eerily calm eyes. The trap was ruined. We will be back with a new copy tomorrow, Tept. Eleanor snapped. She threw the ruined, dripping papers back onto the table. She grabbed her briefcase, and you will sign it. Eleanor stormed out of the house. The front door slammed so hard, the framed pictures on the wall rattled. Clara looked at the puddle of water on the table. She looked at the ruined ink. She smiled. She did not need tomorrow. Tomorrow the war began. The zipper of the canvas duffel bag shrieked in the quiet bedroom. It was a sharp, aggressive sound. It cut through the heavy silence of the house. Outside, the summer storm had finally broken. Rain lashed violently against the window panes. Clara stood in the doorway of the guest bedroom. She watched her husband pack. Harrison was throwing dress shirts and ties into the bag with frantic, jerky movements. He did not bother folding them. He was breathing heavily, playing the role of the deeply exhausted, completely victimized husband. I cannot do this right now, Clara, Harrison said. He shoved a pair of leather shoes into the side pocket. The crying, the staring at the walls, the glass shattering today. You are completely erratic. I cannot focus on my work when I am constantly worried about what crazy thing you are going to do next. Clara rested her hand on the doorframe. The wood was cool under her palm. She said nothing. I need space, he continued, finally turning to look at her. His eyes were wide with fake sincerity. I am going to the Marriott downtown, just for the weekend. Just to clear my head. We both need a minute to breathe. You need to calm down for the baby's sake. He zipped the bag closed. He walked past her. He carried the faint, lingering scent of that cheap vanilla perfume on his skin. He had not even bothered to shower before coming home. Call me if there is an emergency, he called out from the bottom of the stairs. The heavy front door opened, letting in a blast of wet, cold wind. Then it slammed shut. Clara stood at the top of the stairs. She listened to the engine of his car roar to life. She listened to the tires peel out of the wet driveway. She walked slowly back into the master bedroom. She sat on the edge of the mattress. The house was entirely hers now. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her cell phone. She opened her messages. She clicked on Harrison's name. Her thumbs flew across the keyboard. You coward, you liar. I know exactly where you are going. I know about the trust. I know about your mother. You are not going to win. It was a furious paragraph-long text message. The words burned on the bright screen. Clara stared at the message for 5 minutes. Her heart pounded in her throat. Her thumb hovered over the send button. Just one tap, and the war would be out in the open. She took a deep breath, and then she deleted the entire thing, every single word. She closed the messaging app. She opened the family location tracker. He packed his bags for a hotel, but his phone GPS told a different story. The little blue dot representing Harrison did not go toward the downtown Marriott. It turned north. It drove straight into the upscale, newly developed district just 10 minutes from his corporate office. Clara watched the dot stop. It parked at a luxury high-rise apartment complex. Pez apartment. A twisted, sickening image flashed in Clara's mind. Harrison walking through Paige's door. Eleanor sitting on the plush velvet sofa. Pouring champagne. The three of them celebrating. Celebrating that they had successfully pushed the crazy pregnant wife out of the picture. Celebrating the millions of dollars they thought they were about to steal. Clara did not cry. Her tears had dried up days ago. Instead, she opened a new text message. She typed a single sentence to Bridget. He left. It is time. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the city air crisp and clean. Clara sat in a leather chair in a high-rise office building. The room smelled of fresh, bitter black coffee and expensive lemon wood polish. The walls were lined with heavy law books. Across the wide mahogany desk sat Margaret. Margaret was 60 years old. She wore a sharp, tailored charcoal suit. Her silver hair was cut into a sleek, blunt bob. She had eyes like a hawk and a reputation for being the most ruthless divorce attorney in the state. Just Bridget sat in the chair next to Clara, sipping from a porcelain teacup. Margaret adjusted her reading glasses. She was looking at the printed photographs Clara had taken inside the bank vault, the pages of the Sterling family trust. The silence in the office was thick. The only sound was the rustle of the thick paper as Margaret turned the pages. Finally, the lawyer took off her glasses. She set them on the desk with a soft click. Arthur Sterling, Margaret said. Her voice was low and gravelly. I knew him. He was a shark in the boardroom. I see he kept his teeth, even in death. Is it legally binding? Clara asked. Her voice was steady, but her hands gripped the armrests of her chair tightly. Oh, it is airtight, Margaret replied, a grim smile touching the corners of her mouth. Arthur bypassed his wife completely. Eleanor has absolutely no legal right to the company, the liquid assets, or the estate. She is living on borrowed time and stolen money. But she controls the accounts right now, Bridget pointed out. Only by default, Margaret explained. She leaned forward, folding her hands on the desk. Because the beneficiary is not born yet, and Clara is still legally married to Harrison, the lines of authority are blurred. Eleanor is acting as a de facto manager simply because no one has challenged her. She is using the company's LLCC to hide the stolen funds. Margaret looked directly at Clara. Their plan was brilliant. In a very evil way, the lawyer continued. If they had succeeded in committing you to a psychiatric facility, Harrison would be the sole guardian. He would control the trust until your child turns 25. Eleanor controls Harrison. It is a perfect heist. Clara felt a cold chill run down her spine. How do we stop them? Margaret's smile widened. It was a terrifying, beautiful thing to witness. We do not just stop them, Clara. We annihilate them. We are going to file an emergency injunction on all corporate and personal accounts. Today, we are freezing every single dollar they have access to. The credit cards, the checking accounts, the corporate expense accounts. All of it they will notice immediately, Clara said. That is the point. Bridget chimed in. Bridget reached over and patted Clara's arm. She dropped her professional accountant demeanor for just a second. She rolled her eyes. Honey, I never liked him anyway, Bridget said plainly. His eyes are way too close together. He looks like a frightened ferret. You are going to be so much better off. Clara let out a sudden, surprised laugh. It was the first time she had laughed in weeks. The sound was rich and genuine. It broke the heavy tension in the room. Margaret opened a thick manila folder on her desk. She pulled out a stack of pristine white papers. This is not just a divorce proceeding, Clara, Margaret said. Her tone was strictly business again. This is a hostile takeover. Because the trust clearly states that the primary residence belongs to the heir, Eleanor is technically a squatter in her own home. The moment you file for divorce and claim your status as the custodial parent, you become the legal executor of the property. Clara stared at the papers. You mean the estate? I mean the house, the cars, the bank accounts, everything. Margaret confirmed. I have drafted the divorce papers. I have drafted the emergency financial injunction. And I have drafted a formal notice of eviction for Eleanor Sterling, Claire, breath hitched. An eviction notice for the woman who had terrorized her, for the woman who had bought a diamond for the mistress with stolen money. We served them at the exact same time, Margaret said. Maximum impact. No time to hide assets. No time to hire defense attorneys. We cut the head off the snake. Margaret slid the papers across the polished mahogany desk. She offered Clara a pen. It was a heavy silver steel fountain pen. It was cold to the touch. It was not a delicate gold pen meant for a trap. It was a weapon. Clara looked down at the documents. Cussed. She thought about the $10,000 receipt on the kitchen floor. She thought about Paige wearing the necklace at dinner. She thought about Eleanor's cruel, victorious wink. She thought about Harrison, sleeping in his mistress' bed, believing his pregnant wife was sitting at home, losing her mind. They thought she was weak. They thought she was invisible. Clara wrapped her fingers around the cold steel pen. Where do I sign? She asked. On the bottom line, Margaret said. Clara pressed the tip of the pen to the paper. The black ink flowed smoothly. It did not run. It did not blur. It was sharp, dark, and permanent. She signed the divorce papers. She signed the financial injunction. She signed the eviction notice. When she was finished, she set the pen down. The metal clinked against the wood. Done, Clara said. Margaret gathered the papers. She placed them neatly into a fresh folder. Eleanor is hosting her annual summer luncheon at the country club tomorrow afternoon, Margaret noted, looking at her calendar. The entire board of directors will be there, half of the city's elite. I know, Clara said softly. Harrison told me about it weeks ago. Paige is going to be there. Eleanor is planning to officially introduce her to the corporate partners. Margaret looked up. Her hawk eyes gleamed with absolute predatory delight. Well then, Margaret said, I believe it is time you made a public appearance, Clara. Do you have a nice dress? Clara placed her hand on her pregnant belly. She felt a strong, healthy kick against her palm. I have the perfect dress. Clara smiled. The morning of the luncheon, Clara stood in her kitchen. She opened the refrigerator to get a bottle of water. On the middle shelf sat a wedge of expensive imported cheese. Harrison had bought it 3 days ago. It was perfectly good food. It was still wrapped in its pristine paper. Clara picked it up. She tossed it directly into the garbage can. It hit the bottom with a heavy thud. She smiled. Throwing away perfectly good food just because he bought it felt incredibly liberating. She walked upstairs to get dressed. The Oakwood Country Club was a beacon of old money and strict traditions. The grand ballroom was enclosed by massive glass windows, overlooking a perfectly manicured green golf course. The air conditioning hummed loudly, fighting against the sweltering summer heat outside. The room smelled of roasted lamb, expensive champagne, and fresh lilies. Over 200 guests sat at round tables covered in crisp white linen. The clinking of crystal glasses and silver forks filled the air. It was a symphony of wealth. Eleanor stood at the front of the room. She was wearing a tailored emerald green suit. She tapped a silver spoon against her champagne flute. Clink, clink, clink. The chatter in the ballroom died down. All eyes turned to the matriarch of the Sterling family. Harrison sat at the head table just behind his mother. Next to him sat Page. The young assistant was wearing a pale pink silk dress. The $10,000 diamond teardrop pendant rested heavily against her collarbone, catching the light from the chandeliers. Friends, family, and esteemed colleagues, Eleanor began. Her voice echoed through the microphone, smooth and practiced. Thank you for joining us today. This year has been a period of immense transition for Sterling Incorporated. But true leadership is about adapting. She gestured gracefully toward the head table. My son Harrison has stepped up beautifully, and we are thrilled to welcome new, vibrant talent to our corporate family. Paige, please stand up. Paige stood. She offered the crowd a modest, practiced smile. A polite round of applause rippled through the room. Paige has been a savior to Harrison these past few months, Eleanor continued, her voice dripping with fake sincerity. As many of you know, my daughter-in-law has been struggling with severe health issues during her pregnancy. It has been a dark, difficult time for our family, but Paige has provided such vital support. We are so grateful, the crowd murmured in sympathy. A few older women shook their heads with pity. Instead, Eleanor raised her glass to the future of the Sterling family. The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom suddenly swung open. The brass hinges groaned loudly. The waiters carrying trays of champagne stopped dead in their tracks. The guests nearest to the doors turned around. A wave of hushed whispers began to spread across the room. Clara walked in. She did not look tired. She did not look crazy. She looked breathtaking. She wore a stunning, form-fitting crimson-red dress. It did not hide her 8-month pregnant belly. It showcased it. Her dark hair was swept up into a sleek, elegant twist. Her makeup was flawless. She wore no jewelry. She did not need any. She walked with absolute, terrifying confidence. Margaret walked one step behind her to the right. The silver-haired lawyer carried a thick, black leather briefcase. Bridget walked one step behind her to the left. The accountant wore a sharp black suit and a smirk that could cut glass. The room went entirely silent. The only sound was the sharp, rhythmic click of Clara's heels against the hardwood floor. Click, 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 click. Eleanor lowered her champagne glass. Her pristine smile froze. The color rapidly drained from her face. Harrison stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair tipped over backward. It hit the floor with a loud crash. Clara. Harrison choked out. His voice echoed in the silent ballroom. Clara did not stop walking. The sea of wealthy guests parted for her like the Red Sea. She walked directly up to the head table. She stopped 3 feet away from Eleanor. The suffocating smell of rose perfume hung in the air. Clara did not flinch. "Hello, Eleanor," Clara said. Her voice was not amplified by a microphone, but it carried perfectly through the dead quiet room. "I hope I am not interrupting." Eleanor quickly set her glass down. She stepped off the small stage and hurried over. To Clara, she grabbed Clara's arm, digging her manicured nails into the red fabric. "What are you doing here?" Eleanor hissed through a forced smile, keeping her voice low. "You are having an episode. Go home immediately before you embarrass yourself." Clara looked down at Eleanor's hand. "Let go of me," Clara said calmly. She did not yell. She simply stated a command. But her tone was so cold, so entirely devoid of fear, that Eleanor instinctively snatched her hand back. A waiter in a white tuxedo hurried up to the head table. He looked panicked. He held a small black leather booklet. "Mrs. Sterling." The waiter whispered frantically to Eleanor. "I am so sorry to interrupt, but the club manager asked me to speak with you urgently. Your credit card for the catering deposit. It declined." Eleanor blinked. "Excuse me? That is impossible." "Run it again." "We did, ma'am, 3 times. The bank says the account is frozen." Harrison stepped down from the stage. His face was pale and sweaty. "Mother, my corporate card just declined at the bar too." "What is going on?" Clara smiled. It was a small, polite smile. "I can answer that," Clara said. She turned slightly and nodded to Margaret. Margaret stepped forward. The lawyer did not whisper. She spoke with the loud, projecting voice of a woman who had dominated courtrooms for 30 years. "Harrison Sterling," Margaret announced, pulling a thick folder from her briefcase. You are hereby served with papers for divorce. You are also served with an emergency financial injunction. All joint, personal, trust, and corporate accounts tied to the Sterling estate have been legally frozen as of 9 o'clock this morning. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. 200 people leaned forward in their chairs. Harrison stared at the folder. Margaret pushed into his chest. He took it with shaking hands. You froze the accounts, Harrison stammered, looking at Clara in sheer terror. You cannot do that. The company money is in there. My mother's money. It is not your mother's money, Clara said simply. Clara looked directly at Eleanor. The older woman was vibrating with rage. Did you really think Arthur would leave his legacy to you, Eleanor? Clara asked softly. A woman he could not stand to look at? Eleanor's mouth dropped open. The safety deposit box, Clara continued. Box 412. I read the trust. Arthur left everything to the firstborn grandchild. Not you. Not Harrison. You are completely broke. Paige took a step away from Harrison. The young mistress looked at the diamond on her neck and then at Harrison's panicked, sweaty face. The illusion of the wealthy, powerful executive shattered instantly. You are lying, Eleanor shrieked. She forgot about the crowd. She forgot about the wealthy guests watching her. Every move. You are a hysterical, crazy woman. I will have you committed. You will try, Margaret interrupted smoothly. The lawyer pulled a second folder from her briefcase. She held it out to Eleanor. But it is very hard to commit someone when you are homeless. Eleanor Sterling, you are hereby served with a formal notice of eviction. Eleanor stared at the paper. She did not take it. It fluttered to the floor, landing near her expensive designer shoes. Test. As the legal guardian of the sole heir, my client is now the executor of the Sterling Trust. Margaret explained to the silent room. You have 30 days to vacate the primary residence. If you attempt to remove any furniture or assets, you will be arrested for grand larceny. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. No one whispered. No one moved. They simply watched the complete and utter destruction of the Sterling matriarch. Eleanor looked around the room. She looked at her wealthy friends. She looked at the board members. They were all staring at her with wide eyes. No one stepped forward to help her. No one offered a word of defense. She was exposed. The money was gone. The power was gone. Harrison dropped his folder. He fell to his knees, scrambling to pick up the scattered papers. He looked up at Clara. Tears streamed down his face. Clara, please? Harrison begged. His voice cracked. He looked small. He looked pathetic. Please, babe. I am sorry. It was her idea. She made me do it. She made me buy the necklace. I love you. Clara looked down at her husband, the man she had loved for years, the man who had secretly recorded her crying to steal her child. She felt absolutely nothing for him. No anger, no sadness, just a mild, heavy disgust. Do not call me babe, Clara said. She looked at Paige. The young woman was trembling. Keep the necklace, Paige, Clara said calmly. Consider it severance pay, because you are fired. Clara turned around. She did not wait for a response. She did not stick around to watch Eleanor collapse into a chair. She did not wait to hear Harrison's pathetic apologies. She walked back down the center aisle of the ballroom. Her head was held high. Her spine was perfectly straight. They thought. I was a vessel, Clara thought, resting a protective hand on her stomach. They forgot. I was a mother. She pushed the heavy mahogany doors open and walked out into the bright, hot summer sun. She took a deep breath of fresh air. The scent of rose perfume was finally gone. She was entirely free. The dust from the country club luncheon did not just settle, it buried them. Taunt. Over the next 3 weeks, Clara watched the absolute destruction of the Sterling family from a safe, quiet distance. She did not have to lift a single finger. She simply let Margaret, the silver-haired lawyer, do what she did best. Taunt. The phone rang on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Clara was sitting in her living room. She had officially moved out of the marital house and into a beautiful, sunlit rental apartment on the other side of the city. The apartment smelled of fresh linen and lavender. She picked up the phone. Good afternoon, Clara, Margaret said. The lawyer sounded incredibly pleased with herself. Hello, Margaret. Do you have an update? I have the best kind of update, Margaret replied. Her voice crackled slightly over the speaker. The implosion is complete. The eviction was finalized yesterday. Eleanor had to hire a moving company with the last of her personal credit limits. She is out of the estate. Clara took a sip of her warm peppermint tea. Where did she go? That is the poetic part, Margaret chuckled. Harrison could not afford the downtown Marriott anymore because we froze his corporate cards. He had to rent a very small, very dingy two-bedroom apartment near the airport. Eleanor had nowhere else to go. She moved in with him. Clara imagined it. The great, terrifying Eleanor Stursling, forced to live in a cramped apartment with the son she had ruined. And Paige? Clara asked. Oh, Paige is long gone, Margaret said. The moment she realized Harrison was broke, she packed her bags. Word on the street is she took that $10,000 diamond pendant straight to a pawn shop. She cashed it in, blocked Harrison's phone number, and moved to Chicago. She didn't even leave a note. A long silence filled the room. It was a strange feeling. Clara had expected to feel a massive, triumphant high. She expected to want to throw a party, but she did not. Instead, she just felt tired and incredibly peaceful. Watching them turn on each other with quiet, beautiful poetry. Harrison blamed Eleanor for pushing him into the scheme. Eleanor blamed Harrison for being too weak to control his own wife. They were locked in a tiny apartment, bound together by their own toxic, greedy choices. They had become their own punishment. The papers are in the final stages, Margaret continued. Harrison did not even try to fight for custody. He cannot afford a lawyer to challenge the trust. He signed everything away just to avoid being sued for corporate fraud. Thank you, Margaret, Clara whispered. For everything you saved yourself, Clara. I just provided the paperwork. Now, get some rest. That baby is coming soon. Margaret was right. 2 days later, at 3:30 in the morning, Clara woke up to a sharp, sudden pain radiating across her lower back. She sat up in bed. The room was completely dark. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning. Another pain hit her, harder this time. It took her breath away. She felt a sudden rush of warm fluid. Her water had broken. Clara did not panic. She did not cry for the husband who was not there. She simply reached over to her nightstand, picked up her phone, and dialed a number. Bridget answered on the first ring. I am already putting my shoes on. I will be there in 10 minutes. The hospital triage room was bright, cold, and entirely sterile. It smelled heavily of bleach and rubbing alcohol. Clara changed into a pale blue hospital gown. She sat on the edge of the bed. Her hands gripped the thin blanket tightly. A nurse attached a monitor to Clara's stomach. The machine began to beep, beep, beep. It was a steady, rhythmic sound. It was the sound of her baby's strong heartbeat. Bridget stood right beside her. The accountant was holding a cup of ice chips. She looked completely out of her element, but fiercely determined. You are doing great, honey, Bridget said, feeding Clara a small piece of ice. The freezing cold water felt amazing against Clara's dry throat. Your lawyer called my cell phone. The final injunction on the trust is signed by the judge. The money is locked down tight. It is completely yours to manage. Clara nodded, breathing through another heavy contraction. She closed her eyes. Just a month ago, she had imagined this exact moment with absolute terror. She had pictured herself in this hospital bed, alone, while Eleanor and Harrison stood in the hallway with a psychiatrist, waiting to take her baby away. She had pictured herself fighting for her sanity while giving birth. But none of that happened. The door to her hospital room remained closed. There was no heavy scent of rose perfume. There was no cheap vanilla. There was no husband secretly recording her pain. There was only Bridget. There was only safety. Okay, Clara, the doctor said, walking briskly into the room. She was a kind woman with warm brown eyes. You are fully dilated. It is time to meet your little girl. I need you to take a deep breath, hold it, and push. Clara nodded. She reached out. Bridget grabbed her left hand, squeezing it with incredible strength. Clara took a massive deep breath. She closed her eyes, and she pushed. The physical pain was blinding. It was a fierce primal agony that tore through her entire body. But beneath the pain, there was a rising, unstoppable wave of pure power. She pushed for the nights she had spent crying on the kitchen floor. She pushed for the gaslighting. She pushed for the absolute indignity of being treated like a vessel for someone else's wealth. One more big push, Clara, the doctor encouraged. You are almost there. You are doing perfectly. Clara gritted her teeth. She let out a low, guttural groan. She poured every single ounce of her remaining strength into one final massive effort. The pressure suddenly vanished. A second later, a loud, beautiful, furious cry echoed through the sterile hospital room. The first cry of her daughter signaled the absolute end of their reign. Clara fell back against the pillows. She was completely exhausted, covered in sweat, and shaking uncontrollably. Her chest heaved. "She is beautiful, Clara." The doctor smiled. The nurse quickly wrapped the screaming baby in a soft, striped blanket. She carried the tiny bundle over and placed her gently onto Clara's chest. Clara looked down. The baby had a head of thick, dark hair. Her face was red and scrunched up. She was tiny, fragile, and absolutely perfect. The baby stopped crying the moment she felt the warmth of Clara's skin. She let out a soft, tiny sigh, resting her head against Clara's collarbone. Clara wrapped her arms around her daughter. Tears finally spilled over her eyelashes. They were not tears of fear. They were not tears of betrayal. They were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. "Hello, Emma," Clara whispered, kissing the top of the baby's head. The newborn smelled sweet like milk and fresh air. "I am your mom, and I am never going to let anyone hurt you." Bridget wiped her own eyes with the back of her sleeve. "She looks just like you, Clara." "Thank goodness." Clara smiled. She held her daughter tighter. She had done it. She had built her raft. She had navigated the storm, and she had safely reached the shore. 6 months passed. The seasons changed. The sweltering summer heat faded into a crisp, cool, beautiful autumn. The Sterling estate, the massive house with the marble floors, and the creepy grandfather clock was sold. Clara had no desire to live there. It was a house built on lies and cold ambition. She instructed Margaret to liquidate the property. The sale brought in over $4 million. Every single penny went directly into Emma's trust fund. Clara used her authority as the executor to purchase a new home for them. It was not a sprawling, arrogant mansion. It was a beautiful, two-story craftsman house in a quiet, leafy neighborhood. It had a large, wraparound wooden porch. It had a massive backyard with an old oak tree, perfect for a tire swing. It was a home meant for laughter, not for hiding secrets. It was a Sunday morning. Clara stepped out onto the wooden porch. She was wearing a thick, comfortable gray sweater. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun. She held a steaming mug of black coffee in her hands. The air was crisp. The leaves on the trees had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson. A gentle morning breeze rustled the branches, making a soft, shushing sound. Clara walked over to the wooden porch swing. She sat down. Next to her, bundled up in a thick yellow fleece blanket, was 6-month-old Emma. Emma was wide awake. She was holding a small, plush rabbit, babbling happily to herself. She had Clara's bright, observant eyes. Clara took a slow sip of her coffee. The bitter, rich taste warmed her chest. She watched a pair of robins hop across the green lawn. The neighborhood was entirely peaceful. No loud cars, no dramatic entrances, just the quiet hum of a good, simple life. She had heard through the grapevine what had become of her ex-husband. Harrison had been fired from Sterling Incorporated. Without the trust money to back him up, the board of directors quickly realized he was entirely incompetent. He was now working a mid-level sales job at a paper supply company. He was still living in that tiny apartment near the airport with Eleanor. Torn. Eleanor rarely left the apartment. She had lost her country club membership. She had lost her wealthy friends. She spent her days sitting in a cramped living room, complaining about the noise from the airplanes, and blaming Harrison for ruining her life. They were miserable. They were exactly where they deserved to be. Clara reached out and gently rocked the porch swing. The wooden chains creaked softly. Sway, sway, sway. She looked down at her beautiful daughter. Clara used to think forgiveness meant letting someone back into your life. She used to think it meant accepting an apology and pretending the hurt had never happened. She realized now that true forgiveness was something entirely different. True forgiveness was just accepting that their brokenness had nothing to do with her value. Harrison's weakness did not make Clara unlovable. Eleanor's cruelty did not make Clara weak. They were just deeply flawed. Toxic people who had tried to consume her light to hide their own darkness. She did not have to carry their heavy baggage anymore. She had set it down on the floor of that country club, and she had simply walked away. Court. Clara finally understood that the prison door had been unlocked all along. She had been her own warden. She had stayed because she thought she had to be a good wife. She had stayed because she was afraid of the unknown. But the unknown had given her a beautiful house. The unknown had given her financial freedom. The unknown had given her Emma. Emma dropped her plush rabbit. She let out a small, frustrated squeak. Clara smiled. She set her coffee mug down. On the small wooden table, she leaned over and picked up the toy. She handed it back to her daughter. Emma giggled. A bright, musical sound that echoed across the quiet porch. Clara leaned back into the swing. She closed her eyes and let the cool autumn breeze wash over her face. She was 33 years old. She was a mother. She was the sole protector of her own peace. Her future opened up in ways she never could have imagined just a few short months ago. The gaslighting was over. The manipulation was dead. She took a deep breath. The air did not smell like heavy, suffocating rose perfume. It did not smell like cheap, synthetic vanilla. It just smelled like crisp autumn leaves, fresh coffee, and absolute freedom. And it was the most beautiful thing she had ever known.
And just like that, the empire of lies crumbled, not by a scream, but by a signature. As we reach the end of Clara's journey, there is a profound lesson woven into the fabric of this story. We are often taught that being a good person means being a passive one. Society tells us to endure, to forgive unconditionally, and to shrink ourselves to keep the peace, especially when it comes to family. Clara tried to play that role. She tried to be the good, accommodating wife. But what this story so brilliantly exposes is that toxic people do not respect your sacrifices. They only see your boundaries as obstacles to tear down. Eleanor and Harrison built their entire sense of superiority on an illusion. They believed that wealth and manipulation made them untouchable. They looked at a pregnant, exhausted woman and saw nothing but a vessel, a pawn they could easily discard once they got what they wanted. But they made a fatal miscalculation. They underestimated the quiet, terrifying strength of a mother protecting her child. The most beautiful takeaway from this story is Clara's realization about true forgiveness at the very end. Forgiveness is not a free pass for toxic people to re-enter your life. It is not forgetting the gaslighting or the betrayal. True forgiveness is the profound, quiet realization that the brokenness of others has absolutely nothing to do with your inherent value. You do not have to fix them. You do not have to carry their heavy, dark baggage. You are allowed to simply put it down, walk away, and build a beautiful life without them. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to play the game by their rules. Clara didn't stoop to their level, she rose above it. Armed with truth, patience, and unshakable resolve, she proved that you do not need to be loud to be lethal. If you are watching this and you feel trapped in a situation that is draining your light, let Clara's story be your blueprint. Do not panic. Gather your facts. Build your raft in silence and wait for the right moment. The prison door might just be unlocked, waiting for you to simply push it open. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.